Welcome, everyone. I'm John Bouzang. I'm Director of College Counseling, and I'll start by saying how good it is to be here in person with all of you at Family Weekend. Just a show of hands, how many parents of seniors or postgrads? Okay, and then underclass students? All right, so we got a good broad audience, that's good. For parents of juniors or younger, your son or daughter will begin working one-on-one with their assigned college counselor in December of the junior year. And I'll introduce the college counselors. This is Maureen Kelly-Chesky. This is Greg Walsh. And this is Bill Wells behind us. Before I introduce our guest speaker, Michael Port from College of the Holy Cross, I'll provide a quick update regarding the class of 2022 and where they are in this process. Much like previous years, we expect that upwards of 2/3 of the graduating class will submit at least one early application for the November 1st or November 15th deadlines. And in some colleges, Infinite Wisdom, they've even moved that up to October 15th. So they'll hear from us, but anyway. We wrapped up our senior seminar classes in September and have been meeting frequently with our seniors and postgrads as they finalize their college lists, and their application plans, and their personal essays and their supplemental essays, all of which will ensure quality applications ahead of the deadlines. The fall long weekend is always a great opportunity for seniors and postgrads to put the finishing touches. Sometimes more than finishing touches, but the 2 days that we have coming up will ensure that they get those essays done. And then the last step is we will review the applications with them in detail. I'm excited to introduce Michael Port from College of the Holy Cross. Michael, I think I mentioned that a few of our esteemed faculty members are our graduates, including Jim Erzik, Director of our CEIF program, and Dr. John Strauss, Chair of our Science Department. We also have a number of recent graduates, including 2 recipients of the Cushman Award. That's our top prize award at commencement. They are graduates or they are at Holy Cross. I'm sure many here today, like myself, have family and friends who are proud Holy Cross Crusaders. So Michael, please take comfort that you're among friends, that you're most welcome. Michael began his admissions career in 2009 at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, where he earned his master's degree in organizational leadership in 2011. Michael joined the admission team at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, where he discovered either Pat's cheesesteaks or Geno's. Which did you like better?
Actually, Larry's is the spot.
Larry's? I'll have him down there next month. I'm going to check out Larry's. Okay. Michael stayed at St. Joseph's until he was plucked by Hope College of the Holy Cross, and we are so fortunate that took place. It's been a distinct pleasure working with Michael these past 4 years, and I thank him for joining us during this busy season. And I thank your wife, Samantha, for watching the 2 kids, soccer duty this morning, right? So we thank you for that as well. Please join me in welcoming Michael Port.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, John. And I figure, of course, with this being Parents and Family Weekend, and as John mentioned, I do have 2 of my own kids that play soccer right now, but I figure this is an appropriate audience for me to be able to share a story about my own kids, because I feel like we can all relate. And it's always a great thing to be able to talk about your kids, and particularly when kids do so in front of so many people. And so, we recently, of course, all just came out of this pandemic, or coming, I should say, out of this pandemic at this point. And in the midst of it, at least for my family, I have a 3- and a 4-year-old at home. The pandemic was a particularly exciting time to be able to have little mascots join us as part of our work experience for my wife and I. We, of course, were both working remotely, and they would often join us for Zoom sessions and meetings and phone calls and things of that nature. But we've recently, of course, been able to get back now to a little bit more of a normal world. getting back in person every now and again. Our kids are going back to daycare and preschool. But this past week, I am still working remotely. My wife is still working remotely occasionally, and we try to leverage that every now and again by having our kids stay at home and save a little bit of money on daycare as part of that. So this past week, we got a chance to all do the work at home thing again together, which was a hoot. It can be somewhat stressful, as I'm sure we can all relate at times, to be able to balance it all together. So we ended up wrapping up that particular work day, my wife and I, saying we need to get out, we need to do something to just change this scenery and allow our kids to sort of vent some energy a touch. And given the time of the year that it is, we figured we would go ahead and try to kill two birds with one stone, that is, and we would go Halloween shopping and try to find the costumes for our kids. So we packed them up, we got all together, and we ended up going out over to the Halloween spirit shop. Now for my children, this is a very exciting time for Halloween. This is their first one that they're truly aware of. Last year, of course, was canceled, so they didn't get a Halloween last year. And then the year before that, they were 1 and 2 years old, so it's a little bit more of an out-of-body experience, I guess you could say, for them. They got free candy, which is a big win, of course. They were excited about that, but the costumes and walking around and everything else was, it wore down quick, let's put it that way. So this year we've been talking about what are the costumes going to be, what are you going to wear, what are the characters that you're going to take on, and in my house the big television show at the moment is Paw Patrol. If you're not familiar with this cinematic experience, it is a group of dogs who serve as first responders in this little town. So there's Chase the police dog and Marshall the fire dog and so on, and they go and of course help solve problems throughout the town. My children absolutely love it. So we said, what is the costume that you're going to wear? And immediately my son says Marshall the fire dog, that's what I would like to be. My daughter says Everest, who is a husky who helps out with some of their snow rescues here and there, things like that. So we go online, we find these costumes, and they're ecstatic, they're over the moon that these costumes exist in our world, and that they will be able to get ordered and come to us. But as I said with this work at home day, we said, why don't we go see if we can find these things in person? So we make the trip and we tell them, of course, maybe we'll find your costume, maybe we won't, but let's see exactly how it goes. At the very least, they're going to be in a Halloween store and they're just going to, I'm sure, go nuts. And so my son walks in, immediately finds the Marshall costume, done. It's his size, he's ready, he's almost ripping it out of the bag in the middle of the store, ready to put it on already. My daughter, unfortunately, does not find Everest. Everest is a little bit more of a secondary character, it's not as popular as some of the others. So my son, who's ecstatic over here going nuts, is sort of setting the stage for the fact that we are not leaving without a Halloween costume for my daughter. We're not going to be able to order Everest at this point. She needs to find something in the store to come home with. So we say, go ahead, go sort of try to find your costume and see what else you can see out there. She finds a few characters that she's familiar with, and she's a little lukewarm about them. But she ends up actually coming back eventually with a Wonder Woman costume, which is very surprising to my wife and I, because she has no idea who Wonder Woman is. We've never watched the show, we've never watched the movies, never read the comics. She just has found what I think is a dress with a tiara and bracelets, and she's very excited about that fact. And so we say, all right, we can buy this now. Obviously, if you get this, we're not going to get the Everest costume for you, and we want to make sure that that's okay, that you got the right fit in this process. And she's locked in. Great, awesome. So we buy the two costumes, bring them home. We have happy children, which is a victory for all of us for sure. But as it turns out, I ended up buying October outfits more so than Halloween costumes, because they really haven't taken them off as of yet at this point. So hopefully they won't be too ruined before we actually have our Halloween outings that are approaching relatively quickly. But I tell that story not just to obviously tell a story about my children, which I always enjoy doing, but because it actually has a lot of parallels to the college search process that many of you are approaching at this point. And we're all seeing a lot of course, trends emerge right now as a result of the pandemic and how it very much shifted and shaped the college search process. Obviously for the class last year, of course, it shifted things entirely, but it also has brought forward some new trends for the upcoming class and for the upcoming college search processes that I think our students, or your students I should say, should be able to leverage in some really unique ways. And the biggest shift, of course, is that rise of virtual. It's certainly going to rise in all of our lives, not just in the college search process, but the rise of the virtual college search has really become something to take advantage of, something to leverage now. That wasn't necessarily the case previously in the past. You always had websites, of course, and you had maybe virtual tours that colleges and universities were doing, but they weren't necessarily investing a ton of resources and funds into those efforts. But with the pandemic and with the shift to that, there was no choice. We all needed to figure out how to convey our campus communities in an online world, in a virtual community. And so there is now, of course, not only the rise of virtual tours, but the rise of virtual information sessions, opportunities to get to know the members of particular communities, students, professors, faculty members, through conversations and webinars and virtual fall open houses and all of these things that are coming about. And so similar to my kids doing their Halloween search online and looking, of course, through Amazon, essentially, trying to find their right fit Halloween costume, they were able to sort of narrow down that list a little bit. And I think the students can do something similar now at this point, where they can go through this virtual search process to not only determine, of course, again, what a campus looks like through a virtual tour, but also have that understanding of how is a campus community going to affect them on a day-in and day-out basis. And that's an immensely important part of the process, and one of the pieces of advice that I would certainly put out there in this college search is not just to find that understanding of fit in a college or university based on where they are, or the size that they are, or the academic majors and programs that they offer, and that's important, of course. But you also want to ensure that if you're going to go to a college or four-year college university where you're living there, you're spending there more time than anywhere else. And so you want to make sure that the mission, the values of a particular institution, and how those mission and values are conveyed on a day-in and day-out basis are going to be a good fit for these students as they experience these college campuses. And what better way to do that, again, than to be able to have these more in-depth conversations, to be able to talk with students, talk with faculty members. And as I said, this rise of virtual is a really wonderful way to start to narrow the list down a little bit. So obviously you've got 4,000 plus colleges and universities here in the US alone, never mind if you want to go internationally. And so it's a big question, how do I narrow this list down? How do I find the schools that I ultimately want to apply to? And this is a really wonderful way now to start at this point. From there, it can also help to narrow down the list in terms of the schools that you're actually going to be visiting. For my son's case, like I said, when we found the martial costume online, we find it in the Spirit Halloween store, and boom, done. That was a college search, the greatest, easiest college search of all time, so that would be really fantastic, of course, if it works out for some of you in that process. But it's another great example there of if you're visiting an area, especially an area that might have a critical mass of colleges or universities, you can then start to narrow down that list of schools that you're actually going to say, I want to commit my time to visiting this campus, to doing this tour, to seeing it in person, and then ultimately getting that understanding of, does it line up essentially with what I thought it was going to be when I was looking at it online. So those are really important factors to consider now at this point, that I think there is a silver lining, at least one silver lining to take out of this pandemic, and that is the fact that, again, that the college search has become so much more accessible and so much, I think, easier to start at this point for students. So certainly a great thing to be able to leverage moving forward as you, again, kind of get underway with this process and think about those schools that you want to visit and then ultimately get applications out to in the process. I'll get away from my children now, of course. I think I just want to talk in general here about the college search as a whole, because again, there are other trends that are also emerging that we're very much seeing from the admission side of things. And the biggest one, I think, at this point that is probably the most obvious is the rise of test optional. Last year, of course, there were a whole lot of schools that had no other choice but to go test optional. And I'm sure for many colleges and universities, it was a thought that they were going to get there eventually. They likely had it in a 10, 5-year, 20-year plan, whatever it might be, to ultimately make that decision to be a test optional school. But with the pandemic and with the cancellation of so many test scores, test dates, last year there was really no choice. You couldn't expect every single student to come forward with SATs or ACTs. So you almost had to be a test optional institution. And now, coming forward into this year, I think you're going to see a lot of schools stay with that process, and not only stay with it, but also have this understanding of the fact that you can do this process without test scores in hand, and you can do it pretty well as an admission office. So as a result, I think we're going to see a de-emphasis on testing in this admission process, which I think all of us who are professionals on this side are going to welcome in the process. So to be able to say that SATs, ACTs are not going to be the be-all, end-all of this process, I think that's going to be a welcome message, hopefully, to come out of this. Again, another hopeful silver lining to rise out of the pandemic as a result of things. And not only are more schools going to be test optional, but you're also going to see the fact that schools who were test optional, so Holy Cross is an example of that, we've been test optional for 15 years now at this point. Typical year, though, we would see about maybe 40% of an applicant pool go test optional. This past year, it was almost 70% of our applicant pool went test optional, and it was business as usual. So very much so, and you're going to see these schools even that were test optional are recognizing to a greater extent just how much of a test scores don't need to be a huge part of this process. So again, hopefully to the benefit of the students, hopefully to the benefit of parents in this process, that testing really won't necessarily be the be-all end-all if you're moving forward, but we shall see how it all goes. Of course, I'm sure schools will weigh it out as they continue forward in their admission processes. The other aspect that we, of course, saw as a result of the pandemic, again, was that shift to that virtual, not only experience for all of us, but the virtual learning experience, the limitations on extracurricular activities that students experienced during that time, where they didn't necessarily have that chance to be a part of all of the activities or take on the leadership roles that maybe they were hoping to do so as a result, again, of that shift to the virtual world. And so that's something that I just want to say first and foremost from an admission standpoint, we are going to have that understanding from students who are applying to colleges and universities. So for those of you that might have PG students or seniors who are looking to actually send that application forward, just know that we're going to be able to read those applications with that understanding in mind. That the transition to virtual learning, regardless of whether or not it came with different grading systems or different academic approaches, it still was a shift for every single student to ultimately understand how to navigate those waters, so to speak. And so we're going to have that understanding in mind, but there is a rise, of course, in being able to get this message out. From the coalition and the common application, they have added COVID questions at this point, where students can actually inform us about particular circumstances, whether it be something as simple as, I really wanted to take on that leadership role in this particular partner organization, but I wasn't able to. I wanted to take that higher level class, but it wasn't offered this past year. Or whether it's a greater circumstance. Again, maybe it's something that COVID actually affected you medically, maybe a family member medically, and it affected a family circumstance. But I do want to note, again, that COVID question is out there so that students can sort of separate that COVID experience away from their traditional sort of college essay. The essay still should be an opportunity for students to tell us their story, to help them inform us about some aspect of their life that we wouldn't have otherwise understood by just reading their application. So we still encourage students to take that college essay for what it is, share that personal story, and then ultimately, again, if there are those extenuating circumstances, then consider that COVID question again that's on the Common App and the Coalition application. The last, I think, sort of misconception that's going to come out of this process too, is in general this feeling that colleges are going to be harder to get into moving forward. We had so many conversations this last year, and even now coming into this year, about the impact of deferrals, students who defer their acceptances coming into the following year, and how that has somewhat of a ripple effect on various classes moving forward. And I want to be the one to tell you, at least from the process perspective, that did not play out in the way that anybody expected it to. We certainly had more deferral requests during the pandemic than we would in a typical year, but colleges do have the autonomy to ultimately approve or disapprove of deferrals depending on the situation and the circumstance. So I know that we actually had a very discerning approach in looking at these deferral requests and seeing, is this a legitimate request? Are there medical circumstances that are behind this? Are there family circumstances that are behind this? Or is the student looking to play junior hockey for a year and just defer acceptance as a result of that? So there were times where we would look at these and we would say, you know what, we're actually going to approve this deferral, and that brought the numbers down to a more reasonable number, and again, doesn't really allow that ripple effect to move forward into future years. So I think you're going to see admission processes looking relatively similar year over year. The other side of the coin, I will say, is that COVID very much had, of course, a financial impact on every single institution that was out there, but certainly colleges and universities, whether it was lower enrollment that they saw, whether it was just not having students on campus and not getting those room and board fees, or just the fact that we had to adjust to a COVID world, and we had to pay for more testing facilities, and we had to pay for the new COVID protocols and everything that was in place. And so with that, I think, and this is sort of a personal guess, but I think it's a relatively safe guess to say, that you're going to see a lot of schools actually looking to increase enrollment in coming years. It's one of the easier ways to ultimately make up a deficit from a financial standpoint, and so if that is the case, then hopefully you won't necessarily see these hyper-competitive application processes moving forward. Similarly, with the trend last year of so many colleges and universities talking about doubling and tripling their admission numbers, which you may have heard a little bit about, I don't know if that's going to continue moving forward either. Last year, to me, felt a little bit more like a panic year in some ways, where students may not have had that opportunity to actually visit a campus, and not only for the purpose of finding a fit, but for the purpose of finding a school that doesn't fit. Sometimes that's the value of a campus visit, is that you go there and you actually see, you know what, this isn't the place that I thought it was, and this isn't a place that I ultimately want to send an application off to. And so you didn't see students necessarily narrowing down the college list as a result of that last year, which I think, again, resulted in a few more applications being sent out by individual students. And so I can't imagine that we're going to see that repeat process again happening moving forward. I think we're going to see things settle back down to what they have typically been moving forward in terms of traditional application numbers. So I can imagine that the college process, or the college admission process, I should say, should become more competitive moving forward. I think it's ultimately going to go back to hopefully some form of normal, but we've certainly been saying the word normal for a long time. So let's cross our fingers and hope that we can absolutely get there moving forward in the coming years for sure. So those are definitely the trends that we're seeing as part of the process, but I think the big factor here that I want to convey, again, for those of you who are going through this college search process, is to really make sure that you have that consideration in mind of the idea of fit. Because it's not just the academics, again, it's not just how students will be able to leverage majors and programs to move forward into particular career paths and grad school opportunities, and that's, of course, important, but you also want to make sure that you're considering that idea of community fit in the process. How will students settle into a community beyond the academic world, beyond the classroom setting, during their time as an actual person on these college campuses? And again, these virtual opportunities, the on-campus visit opportunities, these are really wonderful opportunities to help you figure that out along the way, and of course help the students figure out what is going to be the school that they're going to be most comfortable and of course most successful at moving forward into their own college processes. So best of luck, of course, in the process, but I think for those of you who do, of course, take the time to do the research, to take advantage of the resources that are around you, you'll find that this tends to be a much easier and smoother process than they may talk about moving forward into it. But I will also note, you have some great resources around you here in the College Counseling Office at WMA, so make sure that you're leveraging the experience that you're seeing here from the professionals that are working with your students as well, because that's also a wonderful way to really make this a much more stress-free process moving forward into the college experience. So, thank you all very much. I appreciate you taking the time here moving forward. I believe we're doing a little Q&A, but I'll
open up to questions, if anybody has any questions.
Yeah.
So for this test optional policy, what is it from a college point of view? I would think the kids that do well on the standardized test, take the test and submit it. The kids that don't as well on the standardized test don't submit it. So that's from a college point of view, how do you separate those two kids?
Yeah.
One submits a test and one doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, from my perspective anyway, and again, this is just from a counselor who's been working at a test optional school for a long time, I really just don't put a lot of emphasis on the number at all. So there is no need necessarily to separate, because if we have a number, what it's representing is 3 or 4 hours worth of work on a Saturday morning. So that can certainly say a lot about the student's academic ability, and the answer really doesn't say a whole lot. So even if we have that test score, it doesn't necessarily give us any indication of the student's academic ability on the day in and day out that they really show us in the high school transcript. It also doesn't give us great comparable work in terms of the student moving forward with the college process, because it's not how we evaluate students academically in the process from a college standpoint. We don't have them sit down every Saturday morning doing 4-hour exams. So whether or not they're doing well or not so well in those environments, it just doesn't have that carryover effect. So at least from my perspective, I don't really find a need to separate whether or not a student submits test scores, because it's just an insignificant part of the process. So if we have the number and the student is proud of it, great. It's wonderful to see the student has done well in test scores. The student is certainly super score and was the highest overall. But at the end of the day, the transcript is really going to be the piece that tells us so much more about a student's ability, more so than, again, that 3 or 4 hour exam on a Saturday morning. So my piece of advice would be to really focus in on what you're doing day in and day out. That comparable work from a high school standpoint of group work, of tests, of quizzes, of papers, of presentations, of research, of writing, all of these pieces that our students are doing now at this point in the high school experience, that's what's going to carry over to the college experience. So if you're successful in that setting, then you're going to see that success carry forward into the college setting, and I think colleges and universities are going to recognize that as well. I hope that helps. Yes?
Related question. On the test optional environment, from the institution standpoint, it's a competitive field among colleges, right? And you're reporting various numbers historically, one of them is SAT average scores, right?
Sure.
So, in the trend, which is a good one, away from test scores, will there also be the emphasis on that? Because if not, I've at least heard anecdotally that folks are worried about, with a smaller pool and a number, if you're below the average, you better not submit your score because you're not going to get in because you're drafting the score down. And versa.
Sure.
So how does that play out, and is there an individualized strategy based on the school and the average score in deciding whether or not this is a bigger score?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously when it comes to submitting a score, that's ultimately going to be each individual student's choice and decision as to whether or not they want that to send forward in the process. My best piece of advice, at least for a student who's in that sort of decision process and that consideration process, is to look at your test scores, and if you see the number and you feel like it matches up relatively well with the GPA, with the transcripts, if you feel like you see that SAT, that ACT, and say, yeah, that's a pretty good representation of the work that I've been doing day in and day out, and I think speaks to my ability as a student, then in that case I would say go ahead and submit the scores. I think that's probably the best mindset to have about going test optional or not going test optional in the process, rather than thinking about how is a individual school going to ultimately look at this one particular number. So it's, I think, more of an individual decision that the student should really evaluate. If they do look at that test score and they say, there is a discrepancy there. That number is not representing all of the work that I've done, again, day in and day out. It's not representing my GPA, my transcripts. Well, then in that case, I would say you should consider taking advantage of the test optional policy. But as I said, especially with so many schools going test optional this past year, the hope moving forward is that more and more schools will take on similar, hopefully, to my mindset, that they really just aren't the be-all, end-all of this process. Now, rankings, of course, are always going to be there, and they're always going to be an important part of the process, whether or not we want them to be. So there are schools that I think just need to be willing to sort of take that hit, so to speak, because there are ranking systems that will actually penalize you in particular ways if you are a particular percentage of test optional, or if you're not submitting enough numbers to give sort of a strong average to whatever that ranking system might be. And I think schools need to be willing to be able to take that step forward and say, that's okay. I'm willing to take that hit in the rankings in order to be a school that, again, de-emphasizes testing in this process and hopefully takes a little bit of stress off the students' shoulders as much as we can.
Thank you, and I'm sorry, one follow-up
Sure.
question to that is more curiosity. But will there be a trend of kind of artificially inflated SAT scores because folks who love the average are deciding to submit that
Sure.
below or not, and could that disincentivize folks from when they're looking at the reported score saying, hey, I don't fit there based on my score? I mean, does it really skew that number at if you're just doing optional versus getting rid of it?
Yeah, absolutely. It very much can and does. It happened to us 15 years ago when we went test optional. We actually saw our average test scores rise as a result of that. And it's going to happen to most schools in the process as well. So that is something as well to consider when thinking about that test optional decision. Maybe another reason, too, to not necessarily look at the middle 50% ranges when you think about whether or not you should submit a test score, because at the end of the day, you will see those students who are, having test score ranges, or test numbers, I should say, that fall into some of the higher end ranges, saying, well, okay, I'm going to go ahead and submit now at this point, and that, of course, will artificially drive up those numbers. So it's all something to keep in mind, that there are these little mechanisms in place, I guess you could say, that are sort of artificially inflating numbers as part of the process. And that's another part of the process where, when I say students should make this an individual decision as to whether or not they should submit test scores, I think that's the more important perspective to take, as opposed to what that middle 50% might be saying or appearing that test scores are in the process. So it's absolutely a great point to make, for sure.
If I could add to that, that's part of the counsel that we provide. We do with each and every student. That question does come up in our meetings, starting in the junior year even, on which test to study for, prep for, take. But ultimately, during the application process, we will have that conversation and involve parents in that as well. Another question?
Yeah.
To piggyback on that, my understanding is that if you don't have to submit this for some of the top level schools now, the applicant pool now is increased, correct? Because to get into a top level school, you might have
Sure.
X SAT score, and now you can apply without that. So that has affected my understanding some of the kids from what I understand.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and I think when you say top level schools and elite level schools, you're looking at schools that already had a 2 to 5% acceptance rate. So even if they increase numbers, it's not as though getting into those schools previously was super easy either way. So I think with those schools, the ones that ultimately make the news more often than not, those are not the schools to base your understanding of the college process and the college search process under. They are living in their own universe. They are seeing numbers that 99% of colleges and universities out there are not seeing, and they are doing processes that 99% of colleges and universities are not doing. So while yes, those schools are likely going to see an increase in applications, again, I don't think it necessarily makes it harder or easier to get into those schools because it was already rather hard to get into those schools. But for the rest of us out there, and the other 99% of colleges and universities that sort of don't meet that profile of the ultra elites that often are the ones talked about in the media, I think again that the process is going to be one that hopefully de-emphasizes testing a little bit more moving forward and allows students again to really focus in and hone in on that academic experience in the high school setting as opposed to again, an exam.
And do you think like the standardized test scores that you take in high school is predictive of their testing for LSATs and CATs? Because, you know, I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Sure. I don't have too much of an opinion on that. I've never had a chance to really see results or numbers based on LSATs and MCATs, things like that. I would assume, of course, obviously, if you're able to do well in a standardized test score environment, then that will probably carry forward into another standardized test score environment, should the time come for you to sit down for some of those graduate level entry exams. But I will say, you know, in terms of moving forward in the college process, it's a great idea, of course, to be able to think about your potential career paths, professional experiences, things along those lines. But I think you should also have that understanding that things may change along the way, and that students may not necessarily have to take an LSAT, may not necessarily have to take an MCAT, depending on what major program may potentially surprise them in the process. So thinking forward, sort of how you can prepare yourself now for what will ultimately be 6 or 5 years away from now, I think that's something that doesn't necessarily need to be on the mindset of students at this point. Because again, college can come with a lot of surprises. I'm sure if any of you have gone to college before or know people who have gone to college before can certainly speak to this, that you take a class or you come in with a plan, I should say, and then you take a class and you talk to a professor or you talk with a student and you suddenly recognize that, wow, that plan is not what I wanted to do and I would love to be able to pursue something else in this direction. So I would also recommend certainly keeping an open mind to change, to new opportunities, to really being surprised in this process more than anything else.
Could I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Could you talk about the changing role of early decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So early decision certainly has become another prominent role here and another prominent trend in the admission office in general, admission world in general, I should say. So for those not familiar, early decision is the act of applying to a college or university, signing a contract ahead of time that says, I will be attending this university if I'm admitted to this institution. So you're locking yourself in, and you're ultimately saying that I'm going to finalize the college search process with a decision that comes back, of course, if it's a mid-decision. Early decision has been leveraged in different ways, certainly by different students, because I think a lot of students look at early decision in some ways as sort of an easier way to get into a college or university. And there are certainly numbers out there that would suggest that. I think generally when you look at colleges and universities, you may see different acceptance rates between early decision and regular decision. And this is the case at Holy Cross as well. But I would also say that if you're using early decision as a way to get into a particular college or trying to kind of game the system in some ways, it's just not the way to approach it. You want to use early decision as a place where you can absolutely see yourself at. You have done the research, you have done the tour, you've met with a counselor or a student or a professor, you talk to your college counselors as well, and ensure that this is somewhere that if I'm admitted, I know I will be successful, I know I will be happy at this institution. If the student gets to that point, then there's certainly a benefit of early decision, again, of being able to have that admit decision to the school as your number one choice, and ultimately being able to, again, finalize the process, wrap it up, and say, I'm in good shape. But if you're looking at it as a way to say, I think that I could get into this school easier through early decision compared to a regular decision or an early action process, I think that's just an incorrect way of approaching the admission process. The other aspect to keep in mind is that early decision numbers often get skewed rather significantly depending on a school's particular population. So again, Holy Cross is a great example of this, where our early decision acceptance rate looks like it's easier to get into Holy Cross this way. The reality is the admission process is no different. We don't read early decision, regular decision applicants any differently in the process. Admission standards are exactly the same. The academic and community fit standards are exactly the same. What has thrown it off, at least for us, is actually athletes. We are a Division I institution. We have 26 D1 men's and women's sports, and we're a school of about 3,000 undergraduate students. So there's a chunk of those students in there for sure that are driving up the numbers and sort of artificially skewing them in such a way that it does look like it's easier to get in. But the reality, again, is that if the fit is there, whether it's early decision or regular decision, from an academic and a community fit standpoint, then we are going to want to say yes to that student. And that's really what it comes down to. So if early decision is available, again, as a school that is an absolute #1 choice, I think that's a great opportunity to jump on it. But if it's a system where you're looking at it and you're saying, I think I can get into this school, I would consider actually opening up your net a little bit wider, considering other schools in the process, and being open to the fact that it's okay to go through a regular decision or early action process and then have options on the other end that you can ultimately say yes to multiple schools. That's not a bad position to be in as a student when you have options available and then different schools that you can, again, see yourself at for sure.
Okay. Another question? So
Sure.
I think it's on this side of the decision, right? On this side of the college experience, it's easier, I think, to default to a transactional purview. What advice would you give, especially for the parents of the graduating class, for how they can best support their kids this time next year when they're in college? What types of behaviors and qualities do you see at Holy Cross or in general that make for a more fulfilling college experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think giving the independence is really going to be the big key there as you get into the college process. I have a colleague actually who just recently had their daughter go off to freshman year of college, and she was saying distinctly, this is the biggest and weirdest thing, is that she was trying to still be that resource for her daughter, still trying to be the one that, like, I wanted to make the call, I wanted to be the one to talk to the office, I wanted to be the one to ensure that she was submitting that document or meeting that deadline or whatever it was. But the colleges are very much standoffish from that. They want the students to follow through with their own processes. They want students to start to own these processes moving forward. And I think as parents, if you can allow them that independence, if you can allow them that opportunity to maybe make a mistake in freshman year and maybe sort of learn from that mistake moving forward, that tends to be a much more valuable experience for those students because it does become something that they then own. They then recognize that, oh, hey, I'm the one that missed that deadline. I'm the one that should have gotten that form together. I'm the one that should have talked to that professor or faculty member. And that, I think, is where we see those levels of growth, those periods of growth from students as they go through the college search process, the college experience in general, I should say. And when they get to junior, senior year, that's really where you see those students that you are excited to sort of see them go off on their own, to see them take on a career path or a grad school opportunity, and you look at those students who say, I think they're going to do really well moving forward into the real world. So allowing students to sort of make those mistakes, particularly early on, I think that's a big transition for sure. As I said, I know my colleague thought that was one of the bigger or more difficult, I should say, aspects of being a parent to a college student, was sort of seeing that mistake happen and knowing that she couldn't necessarily do anything about it, but it was sort of coming regardless. But ultimately, again, the learning experience that comes from that on the other end, I think that's all the more valuable for those students.
Any other questions? Probably have time for one or two more.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So I'm fortunate in that I work at a college that we see a really strong diversity of interests among our students. We don't have sort of one archetype Holy Cross student who's automatically going to be successful based on their experiences or their involvement or their extracurriculars. And I think as a result of that, we can look at as a summer experience as really anything. It's just the opportunity to be active, to be engaged in something that students are passionate about. That is really something that we value more so than any one particular experience in an admission and an application reading process. So to see that a student might be getting a part-time job, for instance, is fantastic. To see that a student might be working in a leadership role as a camp counselor or working with children. To see that a student might be continuing with a sports camp or an athletic endeavor. Any way that they're committing their time to something, again, that they're passionate about, particularly over the summer months, that's always very exciting for us to see. But I think one of the reasons why I really enjoy working at Holy Cross, not to make this a sell on Holy Cross by any means, but it's something that we often see from our students is that strength and diversity of interest among them, that as long as they bring their passions forward in sort of an actionable way, that's really going to speak to us more so than any one particular experience. Any other questions? All right. right.
Okay. Well, Michael, thank you so much. We feel so very fortunate to have you as part of our team, and so grateful that you made the time to be with us. We'll be in the back here if anybody has other questions for about 10 or so minutes. You have 10 more minutes?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. So, all right. Well, thank you very much.
All right, yeah, thank you all so much.